So far, we've talked about some of the most basic input types when it comes to forms. Anything text-based is essentially going to act the same way that we've talked about in the previous lesson. But unfortunately, forms are a little bit more complex than that, and with some of the other elements that you can use, things start to get a little bit more complicated with React. But it's not too bad, so let's walk through it. Down here, I've made some notes about some of the elements that I'd like to talk about. The first one, and probably the easiest to understand, is the text area element. If you've used the text area element in regular HTML before, you know that it is not a self-closing tag like the input element, but instead has a closing tag. If I refresh this page, you can see that it's essentially like an input box, but it's a little bit taller, and the user has the ability to make it bigger or smaller. We also have the ability to change the default height and width with properties called rows and columns. And in regular HTML, if you wanted to pre-populate some text in here, you would do so by typing it in between the opening and closing tags, or rather the inner HTML. Well, what React has done is they wanted to make text area much more similar to the input element. So in React, there's a major difference in the text area element in that it is a self-closing element. This is actually really nice because we are able to use the value property now, and we can use it exactly the same way as we were with an input. This is nice for consistency, and it also makes it really easy to update the value of the thing inside the text area by updating state. So you can see if I were to add some default value in here, that's what shows up in my text area element. And that's it with text area. Let's move on to checkboxes. Checkbox is just a type from input. So input type equals checkbox. But one of the major differences is that you are not going to use a value property like we did with text area or input. Instead, the idea of a checkbox is that it's either checked or it's not checked. This means that we are going to add a checked property here, and I'm going to start putting things on their own lines. We'll have a checked property, and this is going to be determined by some kind of Boolean, because a checkbox is either checked or it's not checked. And so checkboxes typically maintain Booleans in state. For this example, maybe we are checking if the person that we're referring to is friendly. Now in state, I haven't yet defined this, so I would come right up here to state and add an is friendly, and maybe we'll initialize it with true. If I refresh this, you'll see that I now have a checkbox, and it starts out by being checked. We'll notice that if I click it, it's not letting me uncheck it. Think for a second why that might be. Well, down in my checkbox, I've told it that it is checked if this.state.isFriendly is true, and essentially this true value is being forced upon this input. And so even if the user tries to uncheck it, React will say, nope, it is actually checked because this value is true. So you might have noticed something popping up in the console that says that I've provided a value prop without an onChange handler, essentially rendering a read-only field. And that's what we're seeing here. It's read-only. I can't make changes to this because I haven't taught it how to make changes and how to change state. Well, this is where things get tricky, because what I don't want to do is add an onChange that is looking to something like a handle checkbox method, right? It would be nice if I could just use my existing handle change method to handle changes on a checkbox. And so we're going to see how you can do that. First, I'm going to put this to handle change. And just like our other inputs, I'm going to give this a name property that is the same as the thing in state. Is friendly. And now give me a second to make this look a little better in our form over there. Okay, that looks better. And now the tricky part comes in because in an input box, we're keeping track of what's being typed into the input box. You might remember from our handle change, we are grabbing the value, event.target.value, and updating state with the new value. Well, our checkbox doesn't have a value. It has a checked property. And the checked property is actually going to return either true or false. So what we're going to need to do in order to use our same handle change function for our checkbox is we need to check if the element that is being interacted with in the form is a checkbox or not. And so there's a couple things that we need to pull out. First of all, notice how we have type equals checkbox. Type is a property that we can pull from event.target. So besides just the name and the value, if it's an input or a text area, we can also grab the type. And then just like we discussed how checkboxes don't have a value, but instead have a checked property, we can pull that from event.target as well. And so now we know that I can check if the type is a checkbox. I won't be able to do this.setState because I won't have a value property, but instead we'll need to change the name, which is friendly, to whatever the current value of checked is. I could do an if-else statement, or I could just do a ternary here. So I can say, is the type equal to checkbox? If so, we're going to update state in a certain way. But if it's anything other than a checkbox, we'll use our existing this.setState. Now here, we will also run a setState, and we are going to access the name property, but instead of using value, we're going to set it to whatever the value of checked is. Let me open this up a little bit so that it's a little bit easier to read. And now when I refresh, let's see if I'm able to update my checkbox. Look at that. Now when I click the checkbox, it's going through my handle change. It's seeing that the type is a checkbox, and so it's running this.setState. And when I go over to my other input boxes, I can still say my name, and it's updating state in a different way. And while we're at it, to get rid of the warning that we have in our console, let's add an onChange to our text area so that it stops yelling at us. Excellent. Well, now let's talk about radio buttons, because radio buttons are kind of a combination of the input type text and the checkbox. What I mean by that is that they are going to use both a value property and a checked property. So I'm going to make a copy of my checkbox so that I can quickly get something prototyped up. I'm going to change the types here to radio. Let's give the name of, maybe it's gender. And now notice that I'm giving the same name to both of my radio buttons. What this tells the DOM to do is to make sure that I can only choose one of these two radio buttons. However, they're also going to have a value. And the value will be slightly different. So maybe the first one is male and the second one is female. And I'll update my label here. And let's put some breaks in there. Now notice what happens when I go over here. Again, I can't change them. But if I click on is friendly, notice that it chooses one of these two to be checked. This is kind of quirky, and the reason is, first of all, because I copied and pasted, which sometimes leads to funny bugs. It's still saying that it's checked if is friendly is true. But this is where radio buttons are a little bit different, because I can't just say it's checked if some value in state is true, because radio buttons' jobs aren't to maintain true or false values, right? That's what the checkbox is for. Instead, I want this to be checked if the value of this.state.gender is equal to male, and similarly, if this one is equal to female. I don't have gender maintained anywhere in state, so I'll need to go update my state up here. And maybe we'll just start gender as an empty string. Now, when I choose these, it will let me choose one or the other. And under the hood, it's maintaining a gender of either male or female. Again, since I can't pull up the dev tools in Scrimba, let's go down here and just display something here. Okay, and we should probably use some kind of conditional rendering so this doesn't show up until one of these is chosen. But if I choose male and female, it's updating state and therefore updating the text that we're seeing down here. I think this is probably a good point to mention that a lot of this stuff may seem really complicated and different from each other, and it's just important to know that you're not necessarily expected to have all of this memorized. Honestly, I end up coming back to some previous examples that I've written just so I can remember this syntax. This is probably also a great time to mention that there's a really excellent library out there called Formic. There's a few of them, but I'm just going to put the name right here so you can take a look. Formic basically takes all of the pain out of writing React forms. It's a library that you can install and just use their API to make your life dealing with forms much nicer. Okay, the last form element that we're going to talk about is the select box. And in regular HTML, you're probably used to having a select with options. And fortunately, React has chosen to use the value property again so that we can easily determine which of the select elements is chosen, and also to very easily be able to update state. So for example, maybe we are deciding what our favorite color is. We'll have a state property called favorite color, and the value of this whole element is going to be whichever of these options we choose. First thing, let me put favorite color up in my state. And we'll just start it off as blue. Okay, and then down here, I'm going to make sure that I'm watching for a change on my select box. So on change, I'm still going to run my handle change. I also need to give it a name, just like I did with my input boxes. And we'll make sure that this matches the name and state. And then the only other change I need to make is make sure that my options also have a value. And the value here is going to be whatever I want the different options to be. So this will be the value under the hood, and then the text here in the inner HTML is what will be displayed in the select box. And that's probably good enough. Oh, and it looks like I put my slash in the wrong place here. Okay, let's give this a break so it's on its own line. And maybe put another label here. And yes, I understand this form is very ugly right now, but when I click my drop-down box, you'll see I have my options. And before I select something, let's just put another thing down here so I can see that state is updating. Okay, notice that my state initialized correctly, and when I change this, it's changing the value of state. What's so cool about the way that React has chosen to implement the API regarding elements and forms is that it makes it so that we can write a single onChange, or rather handle change. We had to do one workaround with the checkboxes simply because the philosophy behind checkboxes is so different than all the other elements. But essentially, we're reusing this one handle change, and it's working for all the elements in our form. Again, I totally get that this is a lot to digest. We're going to do a practice right after this that should help cement this information a little bit. Don't feel overwhelmed so much with understanding, or rather learning, all of the syntax of every one of these elements, that may distract you from all of the other coolness that React has to offer. Instead, don't be afraid to just practice this a couple times and then come back to it whenever you need to. Eventually, you'll gain a muscle memory that will help you remember all of this. One last thing that I failed to mention in the previous lesson was how to actually submit this form or do something at the end of filling out this form. Kind of two general ways that you could do this, and in either way it's going to be a good idea to put a button in your form of some type. Now in HTML5, the button element, if it's found within a form, acts like the old input type submit, if you're familiar with using that, where you would give it a value that displayed the text on the button and so forth. I personally really dislike the way that input is used in so many different ways, and so I never use the input type submit myself. Instead, buttons in HTML5, if they're found within a form, when they're clicked, they are a submit button, and they will fire the onSubmit of the form itself. So when you want to do something when you're finished with the form, one thing you could do is to just add an on click on your button. Personally, I like to handle that action on the form itself. And so I will have an on submit handler. And we didn't write this, but it would be just as easy as creating another method that's called handle submit and doing something like submitting the form to an API or something like that. Okay, take a deep breath. You've basically finished all of the most important parts of forms. We've talked about input type text and other text-based inputs like numbers and passwords and so forth. But we've also learned how to handle checkboxes, radio buttons, and select boxes, and text areas. Okay, let's move on to the next lesson, which will be a practice of forms.